presentation.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Just to make sure, Alexis, you are recording now? Yeah, oh, there, I see it now. Great. All right. Okay, just confirmation, you see my presentation on screen now? Great. So yeah, my name is Alan Ployce. I'm the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Aquatic Invasive Species Unit Manager. Chelsea Buffington is the unit's green crab lead. And so we're gonna keep moving here. Let's see. All right. So just the basics here. European green crab, Carcinus maenas, is a prohibited level 1 species in Washington State. And under WAC 220643030, it's level 1 because it poses a high invasive risk and are a priority for prevention and expedited rapid response management actions. The goals of our unit is to protect Washington's environmental, economic, and human resources. And DFW is the state lead for preventing the introduction of new, controlling the spread of existing, and eradicating local established European green crab wherever possible. So our objectives to accomplish that goal is collaboration, prevention, early detection, rapid response, control, research. And as you might understand, management is very complex. This is a statewide effort within the entire Salish Sea. It includes local governments and the coast, and includes local governments, state and federal agencies, tribes, many more, including Department of Fisheries and Oceans up in Canada, as well as other stakeholders up in Canada. And I believe, and I hope we have some of those attending today in our. So the structure, and we're charged with the planning, coordination, and leading the implementation of those management actions, including the prevention, early detection, rapid response, control, eradication, and research. So within that management structure, again, as the state agency, we are the lead for state lands and lands that are private lands and such. But there are tribes and federal agencies that have lands, jurisdictions, and we are co-managing with them, consulting or providing assistance as requested. Our department has designated Washington Sea Grant as a lead for the Early Detection Citizen Science Program. This is the CRAB team. And the CRAB team goals are early detection, ability to control, and to increase our ability to control and decrease the impacts of the green crab. They also have long-term data sets to improve our understanding of the estuaries and salt marshes and to track those impacts. And Sea Grant also provides our agency and other organizations with scientific expertise, advice on green crab. And when I say Sea Grant, sorry, Sean, I'm not trying to exclude you from the University of Washington. So when you talk Sea Grant, we also talk University of Washington is a very important partner in this. Collaborative management plans. The one we have right now is the Salish Sea Transboundary Action Plan. And we would like, and we're striving to do a cohesive statewide management plan. And we're working towards that goal. However, our resources are fairly limited right now. And so what we've been doing is supporting local entities in management development. And each design is specific to that region and the local government's capacity. So that's, again, we're looking for a statewide management plan that could include policy coordination and includes the coast and the Salish Sea. So here's just a little bit of a timeline of management activities and funding. Way back in 2015 is when things got started in the Salish Sea as far as new detections, and that was triggered by, well, the management, early detection management of green crab started in 2015, and that was due to the detection of green crab in Sook Basin in the Canadian side of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And their funding is continuing through the end of December 2022. And so you can see that the dark orange are the ones that we're having dedicated funding. And then the lighter orange is where we are hopeful for funding. And the other ones, the dashed lines, are where no funding is currently identified at this time. So we have the early detection. We have Dungeness National Wildlife Refuge removal. That's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have the Northwest Straits Commission up in Drayton Harbor, Lummi Nation, a lot of trapping in there, and just the general Salish Sea, which includes many other tribes and entities. And then on the coast, we've had some teams in coordination with Washington Sea Grant, as well as Macaw tribe has been doing extensive trapping and removal. So we were very lucky to get some funding that is going to be available through June of this year. And this was due to the governor and the 2020 supplemental legislature providing almost $783,000 funding for green crab management, of which DFW has approximately $365,000. Lummi Nation, Macaw Tribe, and Washington Sea Grant received shares of that as well. So again, this funding is good until the end of June, and we have an ask in the legislature right now for continued funding, as well as Washington Sea Grant is leading efforts for additional funding. So thank you to the current management funding supported by the state legislature, our own Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, ANS plan grants, and many others. The EGC management co-managers, partners, and stakeholders, the primary ones are the state, federal, and local governments, tribes, Northwest Straits Commission, Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, shellfish growers, Washington Sea Grant crab team volunteers, and many, many, many more. This could not be done without a really great effort by everyone, and people are pitching in, and I really appreciate that, and thank you so much. So that's all I have for now, and I'm assuming we will continue on with the presentations, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm just going to let Emily introduce herself, and we'll just kind of do that through the program.
Sure thing. Let me share my screen. Okay. So hopefully folks can see my presentation slides now. Let me know if you can't. Thanks, Alan, for the introduction and for providing some background on the status of the management landscape of green crab within Washington State. My name is Emily Grayson, and I'm a marine ecologist with Washington Sea Grant, and I'm currently the lead for the crab team program. Many folks from crab team at Washington Sea Grant are on the call today, and you'll have a chance also to hear from Sean McDonald. Together, we're going to provide an update of the status of green crab, what we've seen in the past 2 years, and a few thoughts on prospects, both for intervention as well as sort of likely changes in the future in the absence of intervention. Before I dive into status, I want to take a second to acknowledge that the information I'm going to share today is a very summarized snapshot of a huge amount of effort that's been conducted by partners over the last many years, but in particular the last year. So many folks in this virtual room, we've enabled some of them to be panelists and provide their own perspectives because they've contributed a lot of time and effort to collecting these observations. Every point on the map I'm going to show you could be a presentation all by itself. There's a lot of detail and expertise in this room, and I'm just going to try to provide a high-level zoomed out summary. The advantage to bringing together information from all of these groups is that it enables us to start to get a handle on what some of the regional patterns are and identify collaboratively as a state how we would like to move forward and address the threat. So I want to thank the folks that have taken the time not only to actually do this work, this hard work in the mud, sweat, and tears, but also to share their data so that we can work together to begin to make sense of all of this. So this is the first time that we've had the chance to convene partners and groups and individuals that are interested in green crab from the entire state in a single forum. Up until this point, some of the similar meetings we've have focused solely on status along a smaller geography, either Washington's inland shores or sites within that geography, or solely on coastal embayments. But what brings us together as a larger group today, and as Chelsea mentioned, this is the largest group that we've gotten together, which is fantastic, are two concerning observations that every group that is working together has had over the last few years. First is that folks are observing green crabs have become more abundant across our geography than they've ever been recorded previously. And second, folks are observing that green crabs are now more widespread than ever previously recorded within Washington waters and shorelines. So these two changes have been increasing the sense of urgency around, in some cases, initiating, in some cases, sustaining, and in some cases, expanding ongoing efforts to respond to this invasion and intervene. Now, to add a little bit of detail and context to this, based on what we know about the history of green crab spread in Washington, as well as the oceanography of the state, we also know that these two regions of Washington state's shorelines currently face different invasion statuses, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to dive into more detail on some of these items, but just in summary, many of folks know that green crab were actually detected on the coastal shorelines nearly 2 decades before being found on inland shorelines. So there's a very different timeline in terms of where folks have been finding green crabs at varying abundances across these years. Second, green crabs are currently appearing at greater relative abundance along coastal shorelines than along inland shorelines. They're currently much more numerous at almost any of the coastal sites than we find them inland. Now I'm going to dive into some snapshots of what 2020 trapping results demonstrated in terms of observations of where green crabs are and how many there are. First, I want to summarize the results of what Alan talked about in terms of the 2020 coastal assessment effort, which was a collaboration between Sea Grant and DFW. This is a year-long effort that only started last July, August, so there's still more work to be done. But the effort is mainly to get an idea of where green crab are and how abundant they are across Washington Pacific shoreline coasts. And this has had a particular focus on Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor, in large part because that's the vast majority of habitat that is most suitable for green crab, and therefore most likely to harbor at some point large populations and be most impacted. However, as you can see, and we have talked a number of times about Macaw Bay, there are also smaller river inputs that could provide suitable habitat for green crab that we'll also be looking at. So this is a snapshot of the relative abundance of green crab at sites that we trapped in 2020. And the data here from Macaw Bay were provided by Adrienne as a part of their long-term removal efforts. The site markers are scaled by the relative abundance of green crabs in traps at these sites. And you can see they range from about 40 to more than 560 crabs in every 100 traps that are set. What I do want to point out that's less evident on this map is that green crabs were found at every single site where traps were set. And even at sites where we didn't set traps, but we went around scouting for habitat, we often, if not always, found evidence of green crab in the form of molts nearby. So places that we looked for green crab, we have always been able to find them on the coast in the past year. And I would add too that in places where we set traps, we're finding green crabs appear in the majority of traps across coastal trapping sites. Zooming in a bit on the coastal embayments, we also observe that there's a spatial pattern of density where there are higher densities relative to estuary mouths than further into the estuaries. In addition, we've observed that green crabs are more widespread across the coastal geography than in the previous assessment. So here I'm going to show a figure from the last assessment that was conducted in 2000 to 2002. I apologize, it's a bit blurry, but I tried to make it comparable in size. The upshot here is that in particular in the southeast corner of Willapa Bay, this is a new detection location for European green crab where they weren't detected in previous efforts. And then I would also add Macaw Bay to this list as well. There was trapping there in the last decade, but they were never detected until 2017. So they're currently more widespread in the past few years than previous efforts. And of course, I've mentioned being more abundant than previous. And if you checked out the handout that went out before the meeting, you'll have seen this figure, which is the only consistent data monitoring data set that we have from coastal estuaries. And this is from a single site stack poll compiled by Sylvia Yamada, who's on the phone today, with support from Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And a lot of the trapping work over these years is done by Andrea Randall. If you look back to 1998, 99, those folks who were on the coast will remember the extreme concern at that time. And to put it in perspective, looking at the capture rates over the last 2 years in particular being much higher than even that initial concern. I want to zoom inland here to look at the Salish Sea for comparison. So these observations are consolidated from a number of partners, many of whom you've seen photos of, working across this geography as well. At sites where we found green crab within the Salish Sea over the last year, the capture rate ranged from 0.2 crabs to 75 crabs per 100 trap sets. That means at Dungeness Spit, for instance, folks had to set 500 traps to catch a single European green crab, and they only captured a total of 3 over the course of the year. And this was 2 orders of magnitude greater in terms of capture rates at Lummi Bay, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that. What this map doesn't show yet is a couple of additional sites. Here I'm going to add site markers, open site markers for sites where green crabs have been found in extremely low abundances in past years, but not the present year, no evidence this year. And all of the places that we looked this year, in some cases several times, up to 6 months of trapping, without any evidence of detecting green crab at these locations in this year or in previous years. So this is a very different situation from the coast, where everywhere we look on the coast, we find green crab. The inverse is sort of true on the inland, where most places we look inland, we don't find green crab at the moment. However, we do see a similar increase in capture rates inland, particularly in the last year. And I want to point out that these capture rates are not occurring evenly over space and time. So below, I've added a graph that shows the proportion of crabs captured from different sites as a measure of a proportion of the total number of green crab captured within the Salish Sea for that year. So what you can see here is that the dominant site has changed each year over time, and that in the most recent year, the increase is largely driven by Lummi Bay. And folks from Lummi are on the call today, and we'll be able to offer you a little bit more detail about that situation if you're interested. It's certainly a unique and compelling one. One point I want to add here is that when we look at crab age classes that we're finding in these, particularly inland, we can see that in nearly every cases along these Salish Sea detections, we're finding crabs, we're detecting them within a year or so of them showing up at these sites the first time. By contrast, on the coast, when we trap at a site, we are finding multiple generations of crabs living together, suggesting they've been present and recruiting into the site or recruiting locally for several years. Zooming back out to the state level, putting the 2 regions together on the same map really highlights the difference in relative abundance. The site of the greatest abundance inland, Lummi Bay, is on par, same order of magnitude as the sites with the lowest abundance on the coastline. So just to put those in relative perspective. So the next thing I want to point out about that's different or comparable between coastal and inland shorelines is the quality of the geographic range. What I mean here is that when we think about the habitats that are suitable for green crab, we find them in the coastal habitats. They're fairly widespread and express continuous populations throughout those particularly suitable habitat types. But that's not the case inland. I showed you that example where at most sites we look at that are suitable for green crab, we're still not finding them at the moment. Obviously, we expect this could very, very well change. This matters not only in terms of local impacts, but in terms of the population growth dynamics we might expect. So I've zoomed in here on Willapa Bay. I mentioned that finding crabs in the southeast corner was particularly significant. The reason is that earlier modeling studies have shown that the circulation patterns within Willapa Bay could mean that green crabs that release larvae from the southern portion of the bay exhibit a greater contribution to population growth within the bay than green crabs that release larvae from the north end of the bay, where most of the larvae get washed out. And so this is sort of well known in terms of circulation patterns in Willapa Bay, where there's high retention time in water parcels further south you go, and that could contribute to faster population growth rates. And there are certainly differences, but the principle is more or less the same with Puget Sound writ large. We don't yet have detections further south than Admiralty Inlet, but if green crabs are found and start reproducing in places like Hood Canal and South Sound, that could ratchet up the population growth a little bit more quickly than crabs further north. This range is likely a function of different population sizes, relative abundances. Where green crabs are rare, they're still restricted to the absolute best habitats where they have the highest survivorship rates. Where populations are larger, they may be able to afford a little bit more attrition and express a wider range of habitat preferences. Now, the last and really key piece I want to cover is that the coast and inland face very different regimes in terms of exposure to larval input, and that this will likely impact population dynamics and intervention strategies moving forward. So of course, Washington State doesn't exist in a vacuum. And zooming out a bit, we know that we not only have to consider larvae moving around within our state, but also from other regional populations of green crab. So I've added markers here for sites from where we have information from collaborators, for instance, at DFO and in Oregon, about the presence of green crab populations. These points aren't scaled in the way that the points in Washington are for the size of those populations, but suffice to say, the solid red dots indicate places where green crabs are very abundant, in some cases more abundant than anywhere we've seen them in Washington. And the open red dots show places where green crabs, we're talking about just a very small number of captures so far compared to those higher abundant sites. So in addition to this overall general connectivity, one really important oceanographic feature that we need to consider when we're thinking about exposure to larvae is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which actually functions as a semi-permeable barrier to larval dispersal. What I want to point out is that in general, surface flow through the Strait of Juan de Fuca is westward. So this means that larvae that are released into the surface water generally, most of the time, get swept out from inland crabs. And it's harder, larvae are not very good swimmers, it's harder for them to get swept in from coastal sources. So in general, we have larvae being swept from places of low abundance outward as opposed to the inverse. That said, we certainly know that this is a weakened connection between our coastal and inland populations, but that that connection does happen from time to time, particularly when we have reversals of current flow. This often happens particularly along the southern part of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And in addition, we have now both modeling and genetic evidence that support that this can and does happen and enable green crab larvae to get dispersed from coastal sources into the Salish Sea. It's an intermittent pattern. It does happen, and there is occasional weak connectivity that can and does influence green crab larval advection into the Salish Sea. However, this is a really different scenario from the sources of larvae that the coastal crabs are exposed to. In particular, larvae are coming from populations further to the south, which are the populations of adult crabs are typically larger than any of the places on our coast. We're talking about Oregon and California. And we also know that green crabs can be swept from the north to the south as well, including from the Salish Sea to coastal estuaries like Willapa Bay and even as far south as Oregon. So this idea of larval exposure to larval input is a really important one to think about what dynamics may be faced by our state in the future. And when I try to sort of put some of these things together and think about what the prospects are for green crabs in the state of Washington. So I think both through potentially local reproduction in some cases and or ongoing larval dispersal from both statewide and regional sources, this means we're likely going to continue to see green crab larvae show up that will need to be addressed and that will potentially have an influence on our shorelines. I also want to point out that as much as we've seen populations increase in the past couple of years, not only inland populations, but coastal populations can theoretically get a lot larger. Most places around us have larger populations. Most places where green crabs are established in other parts of the world have much larger abundances than we do. They pull traps out and they weigh them. They don't count the crabs. So we're still in the relatively earlier stages. Folks might ask if what we're seeing now is the new normal. I think we're in that stage where we haven't seen the new normal yet. This is also a salient transition to the idea that impacts will increase as populations grow. So in terms of what impacts are seeing yet, we probably haven't seen the impacts that are going to be the most concerning yet because populations, we think, are still in the potential to grow phase. I've talked a lot about differences between coast and inland in terms of the invasion status and the invasion history. And this really points to the potential for different management goals and strategies. That's something that Sean's going to talk a little bit about in just a second. But also I want to highlight that even though control and impacts occur at the local scale, it matters at this site what the crabs are doing. The crabs also matter to us all regionally, what's going on in other locations. Control and impacts occur on influence the regional processes. And so I'm really gratified to have us all here in a single room, virtual room, talking to each other about the regional scale. So from here, I'm gonna unshare my screen and allow Sean to take over and share some of his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Emily. I appreciate that. And I also apologize. I lost power briefly, so I missed most of Emily's presentation and Alan. So I'll try not to repeat anything. I believe I need to have screen sharing turned on. Thank you. And I will jump on here and try to make good use of my time. All right. Here we go. Hopefully everyone can see my slides now. Okay, so my name is Sean McDonald and I am a member of Crab Team, also the UW-PI for Crab Team. I'm an associate teaching professor at the University of Washington School. Well, actually, program on the environment, School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences affiliation as well. So I want to start first by, Emily just shared a lot of information with you, which was fantastic, I'm sure, even though I didn't see most of it. But the key thing is that there's a whole lot of information about where green crab are, their numbers. And the first thing that I think is really important to point out is that just because it's a question we get asked a lot, just because green crab are here, and as Emily pointed out, coastal and inland populations could get much larger, populations will grow faster where they are larger, impacts will become larger as populations grow. It's just because their green crab are here does not mean we should throw in the towel. That's what the picture is all about. It can get much worse than that. And so as an illustration, I like to show this short video. This is from the Great Marsh in Massachusetts of a single trap set over 3 hours. And the reason I show this is that we on the West Coast, we're used to seeing green crabs, relative abundance of green crab, high and low abundance. And we see a lot of 20, 30, 50 green crab in a catch. On the East Coast, especially in the Northeast, catches are much, much higher. Green crab have been established there longer, and especially over the last several decades, the numbers have exploded. In this particular trap, this was a trap set for 3 hours, and in that time, it caught over 300 green crab. And they can put these traps back out day after day and continue to get those numbers. So in a nutshell, we ain't seen nothing yet, right? So it could be a lot worse. And so we need to continue control efforts. What I want to talk about today is in light of what Emily showed you regarding the current abundance and what we know of the ecology and the science of the species so far, I want to talk about how that is relevant to management options moving forward. I want to talk about a couple of things: goals, strategies, and tactics in that order. And I think it's important to differentiate those things. So first of all, this is an illustration that Emily showed you, and I think very clearly illustrates how coastal shorelines and inland shorelines are different in terms of relative abundance of green crab, their range, as well as their exposure to additional larval inputs. And because of these distinct patterns, I think we need to consider the specific management goals we might strive for in these places. Two very common management goals: the elimination of green crab, European green crab EGC, from all Washington state waters. An additional management goal, or an alternative management goal, would be to reduce harm or impacts. And these things are not mutually exclusive, but as I hope to show you, in some cases, eliminating all green crab is maybe not something that's achievable in all areas. This again is from Emily's presentation, and I just want to reiterate a couple of things that are different and similar between inland shorelines and coastal shorelines. Inland shorelines, we have relatively small nascent infestations, and then we have the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is a semi-permeable barrier to larvae moving between coastal and inland waters. The coastal shorelines, though, much larger infestations that have been established longer, but they also, the coastal areas are exposed to larvae from larger populations to the north and to the south, where we know there are self-sustaining populations, and we get regular larval input to those coasts, to the coastal shorelines. So what this means is that on the coast, the idea of eliminating all European green crab is really is not necessarily an extremely realistic goal, because although we can locally extirpate green crab, that doesn't mean that they won't continue to show up with seasonal cycles of larval influx. The other thing I want to point out is that because of the occasional weak connectivity between the Salish Sea and the coast, we might choose distinct management goals for the coast and inland waters, but we need to coordinate the management because these are somewhat connected. The next part I want to briefly touch on are strategies, specific strategies that we might enact. The first, of course, is eradication. And I think a lot of folks have talked about eradication. We talk about it an awful lot, of eliminating all European green crab from Washington state waters. That's, of course, easier said than done. And it may, as I've already mentioned, not be feasible along the coastal shorelines because of the influx of larvae from other locations on a regular basis. An alternative to eradication might be suppression. And suppression, believe it or not, is something that's actually been going on for a very long time in places where green crab have been established for a long time. It's been going on really since the 80s in places like Massachusetts. The image here on the left is from the Maine Clammers Association. They have a program called 5 to Stay Alive. It's a catchy name. It basically means that they're encouraging their stakeholders to remove 5 green crab a day, and really to keep the industry alive in this case. So local suppression of green crab, targeted suppression of green crab in some areas to reduce the harm or impacts within those areas. So that's what's going on there in that image on the left. The image on the right is from a paper by Green and Groschel. This is a relatively new paper that talks about some strategies that may be used where eradication isn't necessarily feasible. What Green and Groschel actually call functional eradication, basically reducing the number of green crab in an area to dramatically limit the impact on local ecology as well as resources like shellfish. So where eradication may not be feasible, perhaps suppression and in fact functional eradication or extirpation in specific locations might be achievable. Another thing that, another strategy that we might employ is to reduce larval retention or spread. This is essentially a containment strategy. One way that we could actually employ this particular strategy, again, borrowing from what Emily has already shown you in Willapa Bay, we can go back to some work that I did with Neil Banas back in 2009, where we linked larval abundance and larval behavior of green crab to a relatively high resolution oceanographic model for that estuary. And in this case, what we were most interested in is looking at places where there was spread of larvae as well as retention of larvae. And the really important point to note here is that those warm colors, especially red and orange, those are areas where larvae spawned in those locations would actually be retained within the Willapa Bay system. Whereas the cooler colors, larvae spawned there are going to spread out of that estuary to other locations. So by thinking very carefully about whether or not we want to minimize larval retention or larval spread, we might focus our efforts in those areas to limit the number of larvae produced by removing green crab in those areas. And so in this case, in particular, an area that I'm most concerned or very concerned about is the southern portion of Willapa Bay, where significant retention can occur, and where if green crab numbers were to increase, you might see self-sustaining population. And the last management strategy that I definitely want to point out is about preventing further introduction. It's very I think it's sort of a common idea that, well, if they're here, you know, it's too late to prevent further introductions. And I think that's not really the correct way to think about it. Again, because it can, of course, get much worse, but also we don't want to spread green crab around within our region any more than they already have. So limiting spread, limiting vectors of introduction, such as ballast water, seafood and shellfish shipments, and taking precautions as necessary is very important. And I think the state of Washington is doing a really good job of that, and stakeholders in the region. But just as a sort of a cautionary tale, we can look at what's happened in the Northeast. This is, of course, the Northeast states up into the Canadian Maritimes. Up until the 80s, green crab spread to the north was dramatically limited. In part, it was dramatically limited because winter freezing actually killed green crabs off and forced them into more southern latitudes. Sometime in the 80s, there was a secondary introduction of green crab, of a green crab genetic type from more northern latitudes in Europe. It's shown here in the blue. That new genetic type allowed green crab to spread farther north because these green crab were more cold tolerant. And in fact, what you're seeing here in this image is an increase in hybridization between the southern type and the northern type, which is allowing them to be more successful. So we really want to try to limit additional genetic material coming into our region that might allow green crab to be even more successful than they already are. The last thing I want to point out are tactics that we might use in management. We typically break these tactics down into mechanical, biological, or chemical tactics. The first one is one that we all know about because it's something that we're doing a lot of, and that's trapping. Trapping is used very, very widely in the control of European green crab around the world. And this, again, is an image from Emily's presentation that I think warrants a little more investigation. In particular, I'd like you to take a look at those green bars at the bottom that say Dungeness spit. You'll notice that in 2017 and 18, in those years, Dungeness spit accounted for most green crab captured. It dropped off dramatically in 2019 and was very, very small percentage in 2020. And that's really because of the efforts of folks out in Dungeness spit, Lawrence Silman and his group out there putting in a tremendous amount of effort to eliminate green crab. And in fact, we can look at that a slightly different way. This is total crabs captured as well as average catch rate from 2017 to 2020. And we see that it dramatically declines between 2019 and 2020. I think this demonstrates a couple of very important points. One, trapping can work. Localized trapping can work to eliminate green crabs from an area. It also, I should also point out that trapping is extremely resource intensive, both in terms of human power and financial resources. But last, I also want to point out that this sort of points to the distinction between the Salish Sea and coastal shorelines, in that at the same time that green crab were being trapped out of Dungeness spit, we were seeing continued recruitment in other areas of Washington state, but we did not see continued recruitment to Dungeness spit because of that intermittent barrier in the Strait of Juan de Fuca that limited additional recruitment. So we didn't see any more young of the year crab in that location, which allowed for a greater success of trapping. Another tactic that's been frequently discussed is the use of biological control or biocontrol. One agent that's been referenced for green crab is the use of a rhizocephalin parasite, rhizocephalin barnacle, that actually castrates the crabs and limits their reproductive potential. Armin Kuris and his group investigated this back in the early 2000s. And I should mention that biocontrol for invasive species has been, it's shown intermittent success over time. This is a graphic from that study, and it's a relatively simple graphic showing survival over time and a comparison for animal green crabs infected with this parasite versus Dungeness crab infected with this parasite. And the point that I think is really important to make here is that actually this parasite is more deadly for our native Dungeness crab than it is for green crab. And it has to do with the evolutionary history of the parasite and green crab. But this sort of highlights why biocontrol is something that you have to do very cautiously, because there can be extreme non-target impacts. And of course, because of these results, there was no further effort to introduce the rhizocephalin barnacle here on the West Coast, thankfully. The last tactic, the last primary tactic that I want to mention, the chemical tactic, are biocides. Biocides have been used around the world, both wide-scale spraying as well as poison baits. Some high-profile examples would be control of rats on islands by use of poison baits, or closer to home, the eradication of Spartina from Willapa Bay using herbicides. In the case of European green crab, the most extensive efforts or most extensive investigation of biocides has been by the Australian government. In their emergency pest management plan for green crab, their rapid response manual, they investigated the use of 48 different compounds, both in terms of aerial spraying and poison bait. They investigated those, but didn't move forward with any of them because of significant non-target impacts. Now, that's, I think, important to point out because the Australian government is not shy about using biocides to control other invasive species. Last point I would like to make is about bounty programs. This is sort of a special tactic. Incentivizing capture of green crabs can be done in a number of different ways, but the bounty programs is, I think, one that's been referenced frequently. And there's things about bounty programs that I think need to be carefully considered. There's a mixed legacy of bounty programs for different species. Sometimes it's been successful, many times it has not been successful. There's a bounty program right now for green crab in the Northeast Pacific. This one's from Massachusetts. The thing that's really important to consider, and I'll let you look over the quotes there, is that one, whether or not a bounty program is going to be successful depends in part on the biology, the ecology, and non-target impacts of the species and of the bounty program itself, but it also depends pretty significantly on human behavior and economies. So in this case, in the Northeast Pacific, whereas it would be really great, I'm sorry, in the Northeast United States, whereas it would be really useful to eliminate as many green crab as possible, as quickly as possible, there are alternative incentives to maintain profitability of the bounty program by limiting the number of entrants. And so these sorts of considerations need to be carefully evaluated when instituting anything like a bounty program or any sort of incentives to control green crab. All right, well, I'm out of time. I want to just summarize by saying I hope that I've tried to connect what Emily has already told you with the management options that might be available. To summarize, continued effort is definitely warranted. I think that region-appropriate management options should be considered, whether that's eradication or harm reduction. I think there is strong evidence that trapping is a good tactic for us to continue to use, and probably the best one that we have at our disposal. And that Washington can learn from the experiences of other efforts elsewhere around the world. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The problem, of course, is that we don't have a perfect wheel. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sean. It is my turn. There we go. I think I'm on the right show here. All right. So as Alan introduced me earlier, I am Chelsea Buffington, and I am the operations lead for green crab for the aquatic invasive species with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And as Alan touched on earlier, we do not currently have a statewide management plan. Although we are actively supporting local entities with region-specific management plans, we understand that there is a gap at the state level that requires urgent attention, and we are working on developing those goals and strategies. Our hope is that, our hope is that from this meeting today, we are able to bring together many people from multiple groups that are interested in being a part of this process. And I'm hoping that with over 130 attendees, this is gonna really be possible. As Emily and Sean discussed, green crab populations are still growing and spreading. To actively intervene in the invasion of green crab through removal, it is important for the work that the department and many of our partners have been doing over the past 5 years to not only continue, but to expand and substantially increase the amount of removal trapping, all while we simultaneously work toward more formalized management plans. So to that end, I would like to talk about our goals for building that capacity and allowing for more entities to get involved. To reiterate from earlier, green crab know no boundaries, and we have miles upon miles of shoreline that fall within the jurisdictions of private landowners and local governments and state, federal, and tribal management. Currently, WDFW, Washington Sea Grant, and other partners discussed earlier, and who will be available during the Q&A session, have been doing as much trapping and removal as personnel and resources have allowed. For management of green crab, coordinated and collaborative efforts are critical so that we can accurately track green crab population trends and plan removal and assessment efforts. We know more partnerships and boots in the mud are needed, and there are people out there wanting to get involved in the removal of green crab, and we want to enable them to do so. The more coordination we have will enable us to leverage more resources, avoid competing for the same resources, or duplicating effort. So how can we move forward with building that capacity? As great as it would be to just let people get out and get dirty in the mud, not just their feet, but their hands, knees, whatever might happen, we are committed to the development of a framework that is safe for people and non-target species, as well as being effective in terms of your valuable time and resources. We want to make sure you have all the tools you'll need to get started, whether that's appropriate trainings, obtaining the right permits, designing trapping strategies, getting gear or trapping equipment, or even some assistance with boots in the mud once in a while. I want to bring up a reminder of our goal from earlier. To protect Washington's environmental, economic, and human resources, we must prevent the introduction of new, control the spread of existing, and eradicate locally established green crab wherever possible. To meet these goals, it is important that everyone is trained, connected. Oh, sorry, I did not click it. To meet these goals, it is important that everyone is trained, connected, and using similar protocols and data collection methods in their trapping efforts, which we're going to touch base on here in the next slide. As a department, we need to develop a pathway that allows partners to get started in a way that brings them up to speed with ongoing efforts, allows for collaborative coordinated management strategies, and allows for open communication, because like I said earlier, we want your time and resources to be as effective as possible, and we want to prevent overlap or repetition of simultaneously occurring actions. As a partner, co-manager, stakeholder, or even a private landowner, it is important to have a clear understanding of what your roles and responsibilities will be. Are you wanting to volunteer or coordinate the crab, coordinate with crab team to do monthly monitoring? Or are you doing independent early detection monitoring? Or are you wanting to start your own trapping efforts for control or removal? Or maybe you have land where you want someone to come out and assess the area. After determining what your role might be, the next step would be to reach out to WDFW or Washington Sea Grant to get consultation on best practices and start the development of a trapping strategy that fits your particular location and capacity. Coordinating efforts helps to ensure everyone is on the same page and collecting valuable information that can be widely shared. After that, depending on the location and needs, correct permits and other documentation, such as MOUs, must be obtained. WDFW does have an annual AIS permit that is required for trapping efforts on state land. And for example, Crab Team has a permit they renew every year before getting out into the field. And if you're on this call and you're interested in conducting green crab trapping efforts, please contact me directly and we can start that conversation. As you prepare to get in the field, we ask that partners and any other staff that will be involved in green crab efforts to complete various trainings. These trainings range from species identification, trapping protocols, data collection, and more. As of right now, we are working towards finalizing the required trainings, and we ask that you keep in contact with us as more updates come. It is so important for everyone to have the knowledge and skills they need before getting out into the mud so that your valuable time and effort is the most effective toward reaching our shared goals. One of our big requirements for partners is data sharing. We here in the green crab community are all a little bit nerdy and we love to collect data and we love to share that data wherever possible. Data collection not only allows us to track the invasion, but it helps to inform management on removal efforts and trapping approaches. Data sharing is required for us to adapt our management strategies so that we have the best possible outcome in this battle with green crab. For example, if there is a new detection, we need to have open lines of communication so that we do not lose time in figuring out what is happening, and we need to be able to disseminate effective strategies quickly. Green crab follows an adaptive management-based approach, and we're always learning and improving our management strategies. So if you, here's a little thing I like to wrap up with. If you come across green crab, we ask that you report the sighting through whichever platform works best for you. We ask that photos are taken to confirm the crab's identification as well as the sex or size. And so we ask that a common household item such as a penny is included in the photo so we can use that as reference. We like to have the date and location or how green crab have been captured, whether that's in a recreational crab pot or you found it under a rock as you were walking through the beach. I've also put my personal work and phone number at the bottom so you can contact me directly, and texting is fine too on there. And that wraps up my end of the presentation. So we're going to be making everyone available. So I'm trying to switch gears here. Alexis, I don't know if you want to help me here.
Yeah, are you trying to get to the questions?
Yeah.
No problem. If you want to stop sharing your screen, that might work. Perfect. And then at this point, did you want all the panelists on to answer? Okay. If the panelists that are on want to turn on their cameras, I don't have a preference for who answers some of these, but we do have some questions in the questions box. Emily, I saw that you were answering some of them. Thank you. I guess let's start with...
Can we do an introduction of the panelists?
Oh yeah, good call. Let's do that. Oh, let's see, on my little squares, Neil Harrington, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Neil Harrington. I'm an environmental biologist for the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe on Sequim Bay. And we've been involved in the green crab effort for about 4 years, since 2017, when they were found at the refuge, which is kind of fairly close to our reservation. So that's when we first got involved, and we do a lot of sort of prospect trapping and help Fish and Wildlife and Sea Grant when they've got to do response trappings or other prospect trapping.
Thank you. And then next, Roger Fuller.
Hi, this is Roger Fuller. I'm with the Padilla Bay National Expert Research Reserve, and we've been doing detection trapping since 2000 or 2001, and are very active with control here in Padilla Bay and also helping with the Samish Bay efforts.
Perfect, thank you. Bill Dewey.
Hi all, I'm Bill Dewey, Director of Public Affairs for Taylor Shellfish Farms, and have my own clam farm in Samish Bay, Chuckanut Shellfish, and have been conducting a lot of the trapping efforts there in Samish.
Thanks, Bill. Kate.
Hi everyone, Kate Lytle. I'm the Deputy Director at Washington Sea Grant and a mostly behind the scenes member of Crab Team.
Thank you. Lauren.
Lauren Solman, excuse me, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Dungeness National Wildlife Refuge. Been involved, I'm the deputy project leader for our complex, and been involved personally since 2008, but the refuge has been trapping, prospecting type since 2000. So we've been at it for a long time, and with the discovery there in 2017, had to really ramp things up, but so far, so good.
Thank you. Alex?
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. I'm the Washington Sea Grant Crab Team Coastal Specialist, so I focus all of my time trapping mostly in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor.
Thanks, Alex. Adrian?
Hi, I'm Adrienne Akmajan. I work as the marine ecologist for the Makah tribe, and I've been leading all of the green crab trapping efforts here on the Makah Reservation since they were detected in 2017.
Thank you. Carl?
Hey everyone, Carl Mueller with Lummi Nation, work as a shellfish biologist and have been kind of co-leading Lummi's effort with Nick Jefferson, who you will meet very shortly here.
Jeff.
Go. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jeff Nesbitt, and I'm the director of the Noxious Weed Control Board and Department of Vegetation Management for Pacific County. And I'm really here kind of as support for Ed Darcher, who's been kind of our point man on the green crab scene. So I'm kind of just here to listen, but yeah, Ed will be kind of running the show from the Pacific County Vegetation Management standpoint.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, that's a perfect segue. Ed, do you want to introduce yourself?
Ed Darcher, I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for Pacific County, and we've been trapping since October.
Perfect, thank you. And last but not least, Nick.
Hi, this is Nick Jefferson. I work with Carl, biologist for the Lummi Nation. Thanks for including me.
Perfect, thank you. So, Chelsea, do you want me to just dive into some of the questions that haven't been answered yet?
Yeah, I figured we could answer some of the open ones, and then we could write into them so that we have them on record also.
Perfect. That sounds great. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is going to be recorded. And so all of this information will be available at a later time. But I would still encourage you, if you think of a question as we're going along, to go ahead and write it in the box. And additionally, any questions that are answered for attendees, you can view them in the answered box. So you can kind of go through and see the history of what's already been asked. So to jump into some of the open ones, this could be for anybody. It wasn't addressed to any particular person. Kant wants to know, is there a product or a byproduct that could be produced from harvested European green crab, such as a food source, fertilizer, shell products, or etc.?
I'm not sure who wants to tackle that one.
I'll share a little bit of what I hear. There are some folks, particularly on the East Coast, and this is actually also related to an answer to Linda Shaw's question about other market-based solutions, including, sort of eating green crabs, which of course, to answer the question that we always get asked first, they are edible. And I think, I'm curious among the group of panelists, I know Sean has eaten them. I think there may be some other individuals as well. But in terms of other products, there are folks on the East Coast who have a number of research projects going, trying to figure out what to do with the high biomass of green crab that they do pull out of the water there. One of which is creating, trying to get people interested in eating them as fancy food. And so creating a desire to taste making, essentially. Another is a project to look at creating, I think, a bioplastic based in the shell material of green crab. And then there are folks who have talked about different ways to try to develop them into fertilizer. And some of these ideas, I think, are in the process of starting to try to scale them in terms of, you can take a bucket of green crab and make it into fertilizer, but how do you scale that so that you can actually sell it and make it profitable to do so? So that's my understanding of the general status of several of those products or projects, none of which is likely to be a silver bullet for removing green crab permanently from anywhere or any of the sort of eradication or population control techniques at this stage.
Thanks, Emily. And Alan, I see you have your little hand raised.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up with Emily. Typically when you talk about market-based, that's after your populations have gotten so large, you really don't have anything else to do with them. You got to figure some way to, handle all the crabs that are you're collecting. We are not at that stage right now. I know we're talking about Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor having large populations, but as Sean was saying, we're not nearly where the East Coast is or other high density populations are. So those are potential avenues to go down in the future, but at this point, they're not really on our list. Economic reasons are probably the biggest reason.
Perfect, thank you. Next question, are there different management strategies for areas with high retention versus high potential for dispersal to new areas? And her example was the red areas versus the blue areas in Willapa Bay.
I'm happy to say that I think there could be. I mean, I don't know that we have. I mean, as someone who sort of speaks on the science, I would say I haven't. I think it's a decision that needs to be made as to what kind of management what sort of strategy we decide to implement, or as a group decides to implement, thinking about a management plan. I certainly do believe that there could be different levels of intensity in different areas that could be brought to bear in thinking about whether or not want to really focus on, one idea is extreme efforts at extirpation in the southern portion of Hood Canal, southern portion of Willapa Bay could be warranted, because that's an area where it's harder for the green crab to get down there, for one thing, because of just circulation within the bay. But once they get there and become established, it's going to be harder to get them out. So we know that it's taken quite a long time, many, many years, for them to start to build up numbers in the southern portion of Willapa Bay. And so, thinking about that illustration I showed from Green and Groschalt's paper, that's a place where focused suppression and perhaps local extirpation could be a viable goal, because we can eliminate them from the southern portion of Willapa Bay and prevent them from developing that retention population.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, just add that again, what we've done out in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor in 2020 was a lot of it's exploration. We're trying to figure out where those hotspots are, where the high densities are, and that's critical for us to be able to, to determine where to put our limited resources and the best way to do that. So for Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, we're still in that phase of trying to figure out where the high populations are and how best to approach that. And that's, again, part of a management strategy that we'll be talking about specifically region by region. But that's an important piece. But where we do find higher populations, and again, Drayton Harbor is a good example where we're working with a large group of people and putting together a management plan to address those specifically, and trying to gear up as much as you can in the COVID world, as well as other aspects of, to that. Carl can talk if you'd like about the Lummi situation, but again, when we find higher populations, we shift our management strategies in order to deal with those, because we're very concerned about it creating an established and self-reproducing larvae.
Yeah, and I'll let Nick, pending his connectivity there, Nick can kind of summarize our response along those lines. And maybe not. This actually is a very good example of kind of our working relationship for well over a year. Nick is often our man in the field leading the charge, and he's been out today doing some trapping offshore of the Lummi Sea Pond. A little bit of a tangent here. Yeah, so part of the question we have is whether or not that high density population inside the sea pond has started to kind of make its way, to points outside and maybe even at the interface of intertidal and subtidal. And so Nick is out today retrieving traps that we've set with working with commercial fishermen from Lummi to see if we've seen any of that sort of offshore movement of adult crabs And so far, so good. We have not found any. And yeah, our effort, I would like to say that our numbers have gone down, but we have certainly been applying a lot of pressure inside the Lummi Sea Pond, and have done so with our fellow collaborators in the past year, and are planning to continue that effort. And then, of course, also brainstorming ways to look at longer term, responses that will keep those numbers down as much to a dull roar as we possibly can, and hopefully have similar success that Neil and gang have had out in terms of in the straits there, with seeing a depression or a decline in catch rates. But we are definitely not there yet. But I would say we are staying on top of it, and we shall see what this spring and this season brings.
Perfect, thank you. Another question is, why have European green crab been successful at establishing in so many places? Do they inhabit a unique niche? Are they unpalatable? Do predators not recognize them as prey? Are native predator densities too low because of human harvesting, etc.? So basically, why are they so successful in this area?
One answer might be yes to all of those things. So it's difficult to pin any one reason for success of an invasive. I might some features of that folks like to attribute to successful invasions include things that actually have to do with generalism. So the question asked about filling a specific niche. Actually, in this case, the crab is so much a generalist, it can find a space for itself within a wide range of environmental conditions like temperature, salinity, and it also has a propensity for becoming particularly abundant in terms of having relatively high fecundity rates, and also Sean's least favorite word when it comes to green crab is the word voracious. Nevertheless, it is maybe an apt word for sort of how we see green crabs play a role as predators and competitors, as sort of the role of behavior can play an important part of enabling them to outcompete and have broader and more and deeper impacts than they otherwise might be. Also can contribute to their successful population growth rate. Those are some things. I guess I'd add a few more that are green crabs in our part of the world, and some others appear to be relatively parasite free. This is a thing that happens in species translocations. Some species are moved, but not the predators or parasites or pathogens that have evolved to infect or affect those species. And so that can offer what's called enemy release if the native predators don't fill that role, which is kind of a toss-up in many cases. One good piece of news is that our large cancrid crabs are actually better at sort of interacting with and managing green crabs when the cancrids are adults than many other cancrid crabs in other parts of the world. So we got good cancrids here. And we have seen evidence of predation by some other natives, including river otters and probably gulls and things like that. Those types of interactions rarely exert a high level of population control, but they can do some suppression. Those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sounds good.
And cancrid means to those people who aren't crabaholics?
Yeah, the crabby crabs, Dungeness, rock, graceful crabs are all cancrids. We have a few other species, but those are the best known.
Thank you. A question that I think Emily, you answered this in the chat, but I get it often enough. I thought it worth talking about as a panel with a larger audience. How are the European green crabs that are being caught disposed of?
A large portion of them come to the University of Washington and are stored in a chest freezer until we science them apart. And a large portion, especially from the coast, end up in a chest freezer, I believe, in Olympia. A lot of these crabs are contributing to what our understanding of the invasion so far. So we take tissue samples and do things like look for parasites, unsuccessfully so far, in the crabs. But this is probably a turning point from my perspective in how many we really need for that versus needing to find alternate disposal. Alan has given pretty good guidelines on what needs to be done to safely dispose of crabs.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a little bit. I still have not disposed of our green crab from last season, so I have a few thousand in a cooler, chest freezer. But when that time comes, we do some different things. You know, in the past, we might have autoclaved before disposing of them in an upland landfill. But I just want everyone to know that each green crab, particularly from the Salish Sea at this moment, is valuable. So we do not dispose of them until we are sure that we do not need them any longer. As Emily said, the coast might be a little bit different, and we're coming up with better plans as we move forward.
Right. So as Chelsea had said in her presentation, there's a permit that's required if you're going to be handling live green crab. And within that permit, it gives the guidelines of disposal for the green crab. Obviously, what we don't want to do is, even if they're dead, move them from one watershed to a different watershed, because they could have other parasites and diseases that could affect other native species. So, you know, management of the remnants of the management it's an important task that we take seriously.
Thank you all. I just thought that one was worth answering in person. I get that question a lot. This one, I think, anybody can answer, but it's tailored more toward the growers. Has the shellfish mariculture industry experienced any negative impacts from European green crab?
I'm happy to take a shot at that. It's a kind of a hard question to answer, frankly, because there's lots of things that kill our shellfish, and it's hard to tell if a clam or oyster has been eaten by a Dungeness crab, or rock crab, or a green crab. I will say the one indication of damage has been from a friend in Tamales Bay, California, that grows clams in bags and has had green crab larvae recruit to those bags and eat all the clams in the bags. So I was interested to read the backgrounder that you guys sent out ahead of the meeting there to say, your concern is the biggest damage may be felt in the wild shell fisheries. And, we have some high densities of clams growing in, protection under predator nets or in bags where you can have larvae recruit and do a lot of damage too. So we're not immune from it by any means. So. I know there's other growers in the meeting here, so if you guys have other observations, by all means, put them in the chat.
Yeah, I'll also direct folks. There's a question in the Q&A a bit further down from David Begley that does mention, for example, they could already be having a negative effect on clam populations. So David, I don't know if you're able to provide more details about that in the chat or the Q&A.
He did have another question of what are their effects on eelgrass? If anybody wants to take that one.
I can chime in to say that, there's been extensive work done on the US East Coast through Maine and the Canadian Maritimes, looking at loss of seagrass beds in places where green crab abundance is extremely high. This has actually been pretty well studied in a number of different locations. So green crab, when they reach high densities, through their foraging and digging activities, they can uproot eelgrass, seagrasses. They can eat the roots, they can eat the seeds, they can wreak havoc in restoration habitats as well. So it can be a pretty big deal. And some of the evidence from the East Coast shows some pretty dramatic declines in large eelgrass beds with concomitant issues for the ecosystem, fish and other invertebrates and things like that. On the West Coast, there's less direct evidence, although our counterparts and colleagues in Canada are looking at this very, very closely. There are some areas on the west coast of Vancouver Island where they've seen some declines in eelgrass beds, and I think they're wondering if it has to do with some green crab populations. Brett Howard, who works for DFO, did her dissertation on the topic of green crab impacts, and in fact did quite a few experiments showing that it didn't take extremely high densities of green crab to start to impact eelgrass beds. So they're tracking that, although we don't have definitive evidence. Like many things, we don't have oftentimes definitive evidence of green crab being the culprit, but we're seeing some patterns that are suspect.
Thank you. And then there was a question about volunteer trappers. So does the current requirement for authorized volunteer trappers include collecting data on size distribution and not just counts per trap?
So all of the folks, well, there are different ways that volunteers are plugged into green crab removal efforts. One of which you've heard us talk about is through the Crab Team Early Detection Network. And all of those folks collect information not only on the size distribution of green crabs, which is the minority of their catch, but on every single species that ends up in the traps. They collect a lot of data. So when volunteers participate, they collect the data at the level of the program through which they're volunteering. So Adrienne works with volunteers at Macaw and can talk to you about what data those folks collect. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does collect data on, and volunteers who work with those folks collect size data as well on all green crabs captured.
Thank you. And we've got time for just one or two more questions here.
Alexis.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
With the volunteers, yes, there's a lot of demand. People would like to get out there and help us. Obviously, Drayton Harbor is a good example. There was a large group of people that wanted to get out, get their boots in the mud and work with us. And we really wanted to engage with them. It does take a huge amount of effort, coordination effort, to make sure that there's a lot of safety issues to address. And of course, last year, the COVID season just basically made it impossible to really engage volunteers at that level. However, you could say many of the entities that are on the panel here are volunteers. DFW is not paying them to do this work, and the shellfish growers and other people are out there, and nobody's paying them to do this work. So there's some aspect of that, but they're all incorporated into a larger management structure to make sure that we're all doing things along the same way. We are not encouraging people to go out there and throw traps. I mean, there's a lot of legal reasons that you can't do that because there's, seasons, fishing, hunting seasons and things like that. But it's also a very high safety issue. Most of the trapping that's done is intertidal, and you need to have permission to get out onto those lands. And as many people have experience walking on tidelands, it's a dangerous area. That mud can get really sticky, and we've lost many boots. Thankfully, no people, but many boots and other gear. So this is an area where it sounds like, oh, we got tons of people in the state of the sea that throw out crab pots. Completely different crab pot, completely different areas. We're trying to engage stakeholders, volunteers in this aspect, and we will be continuing to try to build that aspect of our program.
Thanks, Alan. So we've got time for about one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea just to sort of wrap up part one. So the last question we'll probably have time to get to. Someone asked, has anyone conducted winter dive observations to assess what these crabs do at lower temperatures? And then I see that Carl has done some diving, and Sean might also be able to contribute to this question.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I can speak to the dive work I've done up in Lummi, which has actually been inside the sea pond. We are not talking big spooky depths. Sorry about that bird in the background there. We have a little competition going on. Anyway, the long and the short of it is just some dive work done in the early fall in the sea pond. Did not find any evidence of the crabs during those dives. And part of that trapping effort that I mentioned a few minutes ago is kind of related to something that might be considered in more diveable depths. Short answer here, very limited dive work, and I'm happy to talk on the side about that. And I know that Sean has done more types of snorkeling and diving, possibly down in California, I believe. But to date, very limited work up this way. We still haven't got that sort of smoking gun evidence of their sort of more offshore movement yet. But take it away, Sean.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, we have green crab are primarily a shore crab. They tend to occupy the high to mid shore, but especially larger animals will move into deeper water, and seasonally we have evidence of them moving into deeper water. Some of that evidence comes from shellfish growers that have found green crab on their beds in deeper intertidal or shallow subtidal waters. In Europe, there's quite a bit of evidence for green crab in places where they're abundant, down to depths of 60, 70, 80 feet. That's not their primary habitat, but they do venture down to those depths. I have never actually seen a green crab on scuba, but snorkeling all the time in relatively shallow water. Back in the late 90s, we used to do a lot of snorkeling out in Willapa Bay among the Spartina and find them in large numbers.
Thank you, Sean and Carl. So just to wrap up here, all of the questions and answers, we will be summarizing these and providing them in an email follow-up, as well as video links to this recorded part of the presentation. And we might have a survey for you guys to fill out also. I just want to say thank you again to the 130 people that attended this meeting. That is probably the largest meeting that I've been in with green crab, so yay to us. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And so our session 1 is over. And the second session is going to start at 2:45. We're going to take a 15-minute break. And that session is directed more towards those with boots in the mud, those that are wanting to get boots in the mud, or those that have lands that we've discussed with prior, or that want to talk to us about doing some assessments on their property. It's also for anyone that is wanted to get involved in that presentation I gave, something that sounds more along the lines of what they're looking for. So please return at that time. Anyone?
Chelsea, Alexis, I just wanted to thank again everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. What you heard today were options. Everything is still on the table. We want to deal with green crab. We will be working with everybody, but this really gives a fantastic summary of the status on the coast and in the Salish Sea, and what the management options are, and our knowledge of those management options at this time. But again, we're open to discussions of how best to move forward on this. So again, thanks everybody, appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day for those that are leaving.